Welcome to Talks History with Donnie Dodson. Panem et circenses. This was the phrase coined by the Roman poet Juvenal in the early 2nd century AD, bread and circuses. It's a phrase that has echoed throughout history, often wielded as a cynical truth. Give the people just enough food, enough entertainment, and they won't revolt. It's been used to explain how empires keep control, not by iron-fisted rule alone, but through the comfort and distraction of entertainment. Feed the belly, feed the eyes, and the masses will stay tame. But that's not quite the angle I'm exploring today. Because while the concept of circuses as a political tool is fascinating, and honestly deserves its own episode, this time, I just want to talk about circuses in another light. Not as instruments of control, but of pacification. Not just the crowd, but of the ancient volatile force that still churns beneath us as a civilization. The human need for violence. And that leads me to a question I straight up don't have the answer to, and maybe someone listening does. Maybe there's a philosopher out there in my audience who's thought about this more than I have. But here it is. Does man have an inherent need for violence, even in times of peace? Is it wired into our biology and into our soul? Is there something inside of us, especially in young men, that seeks out combat, even when the world around us doesn't demand it? Because if the answer is yes, then we have to ask the next question. What happens when war is no longer an option, or at least not a popular option at the present moment? That's, in my opinion, where sports come in. Today's episode isn't about games in the modern sense. It's about competition as micro-warfare, about ritualized combat, about the stadium as a battlefield substitute. And it leads us to the real question at the heart of this episode. Do sports actually prevent wars? Or at the very least, do they keep the dam from breaking? Because if we do have this internal pressure, this built-in need for conflict, then maybe sports are the valve. Maybe they're like a release. And it's not hard to see why people might think that. I mean, throughout history, humanity hasn't just enjoyed sports, we've revered them. We've turned games and their rituals into symbols of identity, into matters of life and death, sometimes even literally. And sports have always had this strange reflection of war. They're structured, rule-based, and they carry out the energy of a battle. You've got opposing sides, strategy, physical dominance, and territorial gain. I think a good sort of example of this is take American football, for those that live in the States. Just take a step back and look at how militaristic it truly is. You've got a draft, literally a draft, where players are selected like soldiers getting ready for combat. You've got uniforms, helmets, face paint. Coaches on the sidelines draw up battle plans, calling plays like generals from a command tent. At the line of scrimmage, that's your front line, that's your trench. The quarterback, he's your field commander. The blitz, that's a full-on assault. Tactical formation, territorial advancement, sacrifices made to gain ground. It's all there. Even the language we use is warlike. They dominated, they crushed them. They went to war in the trenches. The Super Bowl isn't just a game, it's the final ultimate battle of a season-long campaign. And the fans? We're not watching for polite entertainment. We chant, we scream, we paint ourselves in colors. We create tribal identities. If you're from Philadelphia and someone walks in wearing a Dallas Cowboys jersey, it's on. There's been hundreds of instances of fans literally beating each other up because of the passion of their team. There's something primal being triggered here. This isn't just American football. It's soccer, rugby, hockey, the gladiators of Rome, Mayan ball courts, Zulu stick fighting of Africa, sumo wrestling in Japan. It's everywhere and it's global. It makes you wonder, are we playing games or reenacting ancient instincts? Because long before stadium lights and billion-dollar endorsements and fantasy leagues, sports were already there. If you trace the human timeline back to its earliest brushstrokes, you find that games, physical contest, are as ancient as storytelling and fire. Some of the earliest cave paintings in Lascaux, France from over 17,000 years ago depict scenes of sprinting, wrestling, or hunting in competition. It wasn't just survival, but something ritualized. It was something structured and something a little bit more. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, we find Sumerian carvings of wrestling matches, complete with referees. In ancient Egypt, they painted rows of men boxing, fencing with sticks, grappling in something that looks an awful lot like Greco-Roman wrestling. And let's not forget the Mesoamerican ball game. Played for over 3,000 years across ancient Central America, the Olmecs, the Maya, and later the Aztecs, this wasn't just a game. It was a ritual and a ceremony and a showdown wrapped into layers of cosmology, kingship, and a cosmic balance. The court itself was shaped like an eye, stone walls towering on either side, and sometimes remotely carved with glyphs and gods watching from above. The players wore padded armor and heavy belts, and the goal, depending on the era, was to keep a dense rubber ball in motion using only their hips, elbows, knees, and sometimes forearms. No hands and no feet. It sounds pretty hard in my opinion. Now imagine doing that while knowing that if you lose, there's a chance you'll be sacrificed. Yeah, that's how high these stakes actually were. Not every game ended in death, but some did, especially when the elites got involved. The ball game wasn't just a pastime, it was a spiritual showdown. The Maya believed in a duality of light and darkness in the world, and this game echoed the mythic story of Popol Vuh, where hero twins descended into the underworld to win a ball game against the gods of death. And losing wasn't just about shame, it was a cosmic failure that could cost you your life. Now just for a second, could you imagine that today? Picture like LeBron James missing a buzzer beater in Game 7 of the finals, and then being quietly led by torchlight to a sacrificial altar behind the stadium. Or like Tom Brady after throwing a pick six in overtime, being escorted by high priest in robes while fans chant solemnly in the stands. A slow drum beat being escorted up to the altar facing the sun. It's absurd, right? But it's real. That was the vibe of some of these ancient games. You didn't just play for a trophy. You played for literally your life and your kingdom and your gods. And in that world, the line between war and sport didn't just blur. It really disappeared. Sport was war, symbolic war, ritualized war, theater of the gods, of the people, and for power. And yet the people still played, willingly, proudly, and it was an honor for the Aztecs and the Maya. So again, we circle back to this kind of central question here. Why? Why are we so drawn to these high-stakes contests? Why does humanity keep returning to their arena century after century? Because maybe even in times of peace, we're still wired for this certain aspect of conflict. And maybe games, no matter how brutal, give us a way to satisfy that urge without burning it all down. Let's shift gears for a second. Let's hop across time and the globe to something that might just feel a little bit more familiar, though still ancient and still epic. Let's travel back to the birthplace of Western sport, the Olympic Games of ancient Greece. Now I want you to try to imagine for a second being a spectator in the 5th century BC. The sun is beating down on the dusty plains of Olympia. There's a buzz in the air. Thousands of people from across the Greek world have gathered. Everyone from farmers to warriors to politicians to philosophers. No phones, no tickets, just people crammed together, sweating in the heat, waiting for the games to begin. And this wasn't just about watching some guys run fast or throw stuff. It was a sacred event. The games were held in honor of Zeus himself. And towering over the grounds is a statue of him so massive and majestic, it's considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And the athletes were treated like rock stars, sort of similar to today. They were like superheroes. They were there to make history. But the craziest part, to make this happen, Greece literally had to stop fighting. These weren't just rival cities, they were brutal enemies of each other. Athens and Sparta shared like a similar culture, but at the end of the day, the two city-states really hated each other. But for the Olympics, they agreed to a truce. This was called the Ekeria, a temporary peace so everyone could travel to Olympia safely and take part in something bigger than war. No one made them. There was no police force in the ancient Greek world, no central government forcing cooperation. They did it because these games mattered so much in a religious sense. And in my opinion, that's kind of amazing. In a world where stabbing someone over land disputes was a weekly event, they pressed pause to wrestle in dirt for glory and God. So let's hang out here for a little longer. Let's walk through the events, the culture, the pressure, and ask the big question, did it actually work? Let's take a step back and look at how the Olympic Games really began. The first recorded games were held in 776 BC in Olympia. the sanctuary site in the western Peloponnese, not far from the Alpheus River. These really weren't the games we think of them today. They were part of a religious festival in honor of Zeus, the highest of the Greek gods. At the beginning, there was just one single event, the Stadion race, a sprint of roughly 200 meters. One winner, no silver, no bronze, just a single name remembered, Corobius of Elis. A cook became the first Olympic champion we know, and from that single event, the games gradually expanded over the following centuries. And by the 7th century BC, the program had grown to include wrestling, boxing, discus, javelin, long jump, and chariot racing. One of the most intense events was the Pankration, a form of unarmed combat that combined wrestling and striking. It was harsh, often violent, and victory sometimes came at great physical cost. A competitor could only win by submission or knockout. Stories survived of matches being ended in either broken bones or death. But even with that intensity, these games were not simply just athletic competitions. They were part of the sacred ritual. Athletes were required to take an oath before a statue of Zeus, swearing to train and compete honorably. And cheating was taken very seriously. Those who were caught had to pay for statues of Zeus to be erected at Olympia, engraved with their names and offenses in dishonor. These weren't trophies, they were warnings to cheaters. The games took place every 4 years, and the cycle became so important that the Greeks actually used it to mark time in their historical records. An event might be said to have happened in the second year of the 23rd Olympiad. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Olympics was what it demanded from the Greek world: peace. The Greek city-states were often at war. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and many others had their rivalries, alliances, and conflicts. Yet every 4 years they agreed to an Olympic truce. During this truce, all hostilities were expected to cease so that athletes, officials, and spectators could travel safely to Olympia and return home again. This didn't always work perfectly. There were violations, and at times the truce was just straight up ignored. The very idea of halting war for the sake of sport was extraordinary at the time. In a fragmented world with city-states and no central government, the games held enough cultural and spiritual significance to bring people together, even if for a few days. And athletes didn't compete for money or medal. The prize was a simple crown of olive leaves, cut from a sacred tree near the temple of Zeus. But the honor of winning, the recognition of one city, the lifelong reputation, it deeply mattered to the athletes. Some victors were given free meals for life, front row seats at public events, or even statues commissioned in their image. The games continued for over 1,000 years, surviving political upheavals, invasions, and the rise of new empires. But in 393 CE, under the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I, the games were officially banned along with the other traditional pagan festivals. And just like that, this long, remarkable tradition ended. But its legacy didn't vanish. The memory of the games, their ability to unite divided people, to turn rivalries into ritual, to offer a peaceful alternative to war, has stayed with us into the modern era. And in many ways, it's a memory we've been trying to live up to ever since our modern Olympics. Now, this all sounds really noble. City-states putting aside their weapons, making long pilgrimages to Olympia, competing under a shared truce in the name of peace and the gods. It's powerful imagery. But let's step back and ask, did it work? Did the Olympic Games actually prevent war between the Greeks? Or did it just temporarily pause it? Well, the reality is it's a bit more complicated. Because while the idea of the Olympic truce is something we admire today, the Greeks didn't really always live up to it. And yes, there were many years where it was honored, but the truth is the Olympic Games were not some magical cure for the violence in the ancient Greek world. The Greek city-states were almost constantly at war with each other. So let's take a little bit of a closer look. During the 5th century BC, one of the most brutal and drawn-out conflicts in Greek history broke out, the Peloponnesian War. It was essentially the two superpowers of Greece at the time, Athens and Sparta, and their respective allies fighting for power, influence, and control over the Greek world. This war that lasted from 431 to 404, nearly 3 decades of shifting alliances, sieges, betrayals, and bloodshed. And guess what? The Olympics happened right in the middle of all of this warfare. In fact, there's a notable example in 420 BC of the Spartans violating the Olympic truce by launching a military campaign in Elis. Ironically, the very region that hosted the Olympic Games. As a result, they were banned from participating that year. So Sparta, one of the greatest military powers of Greece, were literally barred from the games because they couldn't put down their weapons. Now fast forward to last year in 2024. We're seeing literally the same thing play out. Russian athletes, due to the ongoing war in Ukraine, after a long-standing doping scandal, were banned or restricted from competing under the Russian flag at the modern Olympic Games. Just like in ancient Greece, a major power was sidelined, not for lack of skill, for violating the larger spirit of peace and fair competition. So while the Olympic truce was honored enough to become tradition, it was far from universal. And it didn't prevent war, it just carved out a brief space, a symbolic moment, where something other than war could take the stage. With all that said, it doesn't make it meaningless. Because for a world as fragmented and volatile as ancient Greece, the fact that this agreement existed at all was often respected, was significant in itself. These weren't neighboring towns squabbling over farmland. These were fiercely proud, independent city-states with totally different values. Sparta was a militarized society obsessed with discipline and dominance. Athens was democratic and artistic and naval-focused. Thebes had its own ambition. Corinth controlled the key trade routes. And yet, every 4 years, they all agreed to meet, not to fight, but to compete with each other in respect and glory. So no, the Olympics didn't stop war, but they may have channeled some of that energy, redirected it into something structured, ritualized, and honored by the gods. And maybe that was the point. Because in a world where there isn't a real concept of lasting peace, where glory in battle was still considered the highest virtue, sport offered a different kind of glory, a clean fight, a fair contest, a moment where victory didn't mean someone else had to die. And even during wartime, you could still see an Olympic champion. You could still represent your city, not with a sword or shield, but with speed, strength, and skill. And that mattered. So while the games didn't all out prevent war, they offered a glimpse of something else, something higher, maybe even something a little bit better. But let's move forward in time now, from the rocky hills and the sacred olive groves of Greece to the heart of an empire, Rome. Because if the Greeks used sport to try to unite and create peace, the Romans used it to maintain order. Remember that quote we started the episode with, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. That wasn't just poetry. It was Roman police state policy. The Roman Empire, especially in its latter stages, was a vast, complicated machine. You had millions of people, different cultures, ethnicities, classes, living under one central power. It was very cosmopolitan. The Senate might have been arguing over policy, the provinces might have been stirring the rebellion, but as long as the people in Rome had enough food and enough entertainment, they stayed pretty quiet. And entertainment in Rome meant the arena, and the arena itself was an absolute spectacle. The Colosseum, finished in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, wasn't just a building, it was a message to the public, a monument to the might of Rome, a symbol that said, we don't just conquer, you belong to something greater now. As we all know what happened inside, it was the gladiatorial games. Thousands of men, some prisoners of war, others slaves, others criminals, and sometimes even volunteers, trained to fight and often die for the amusement of the crowd. And this wasn't sport in the way we talked about in Greece. There was no Olympic ideals, no sacred truce, no oaths to the gods of fair play. This was blood, sand, and steel, brutality wrapped in ceremony. It's easy to romanticize the gladiators now. Russell Crowe screaming, "Are you not entertained?" and all that, but the reality was a lot darker. These men were pretty much property, and the games were a pressure valve, a way to give the Roman population a taste of violence, glory, and death, without any real risk to the population or the system. And it worked really well. When grain shipments were late, when taxes were too high, when political scandal shook the upper class, the emperors didn't offer reforms, they offered just more games. Keep the people fed and entertained and they won't rise up. That was the Roman motto. It was a different kind of pacification. Not through shared ritual like in Greece, but through sheer spectacle, distraction. And if you think about it, it really wasn't just for the masses. These games were also a political theater. Emperors sat front and center. Victories and executions happened with a nod of their head. The arena became a place where leaders performed their power, where mercy or cruelty could be shown in full view of tens of thousands of people. And sometimes just watching the emperor's reaction during a fight told you everything you needed to know about who was in control. Now, were the games enough to stop Rome from falling apart? Absolutely not. But they kept things quiet for a long time. They created a rhythm and a ritual. They gave people a sense of involvement in the spectacle of empire. And once again, we're asking the same question. Is this a form of war or pretty much a replacement for it? Because Rome didn't stop fighting on the battlefield, but at home, they turned violence into performance, and the people cheered for it. The Colosseum wasn't just Rome's greatest architectural marvel, it was a mirror into their society, a mirror reflecting what Rome truly valued: strength, honor, dominance, conquest, order, and spectacle. If you wanted to understand what made the Roman Empire tick, you didn't have to read a scroll, visit a temple, or travel to the battlefield. You just had to sit in the stands. At the empire's very core, it was a military machine. From the early republic to the vast empire of the Caesars, everything was built on conquest. Its heroes weren't poets or philosophers, they were generals. Men like Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal, Julius Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon and wrote his victories into history with blood and ink, Trajan, who expanded Rome to its largest size. And when the empire's frontiers pushed farther than ever, from Britannia to Mesopotamia, Rome brought its martial spirit back home to the arena. That's where the gladiatorial games came in. Originally, these weren't even state-sponsored. The first known gladiatorial fights in Rome go back to 264 BC at a private funeral. Two sons honored their father by having slaves fight to the death in front of guests. I mean, by modern standard, it was a pretty grim tribute and pretty disgusting, but one that spoke volumes about Roman values: strength, honor, and the will to face death head-on. Over time, the fights evolved. By the time of Emperor Augustus, they were a central institution to the state. They were state-funded, organized, and expanded. Emperors quickly realized if war made Rome great, then stimulating war could keep it unified and entertained. Mornings would open with wild animal hunts. You'd see leopards, lions, even elephants brought from the corners of the empire, slaughtered by hunters or sometimes unleashed on prisoners. By midday, there were public executions. Criminals, traitors, even Christians in later periods were killed in creative and horrifying ways. Burned, mauled, crucified, buried alive, all in full view of the crowd. Justice in Rome was something you watched like a halftime show. And in the afternoon came the main event, the gladiators. And they weren't all slaves. Some were, of course, and there were a lot of prisoners of war and condemned criminals from other parts of the empire, but many were actually volunteers, men who signed up for the fight to train and possibly die for the chance at fame. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the modern day athlete sacrificing everything to achieve like the glory of either winning the championship or getting the sponsorship deals or the fame that comes with it. These men were known, admired, and even cheered for like celebrities, very similar to our modern day athletes. And there were different classes and styles of fighters too. Each type of gladiator had its distinct fighting style, from broad shields and fish-shaped helmets to nets and tridents. There was like a develop of fan favoritism among the gladiators. It was a system and a brand and an entertainment industry built on the aesthetics of war. To the Romans, this was all about virtus, the Roman ideal of masculine virtue. Bravery, endurance, discipline, facing death without fear. A good gladiator didn't just fight well, he died well, and the crowd respected that. And when most people think of the Roman gladiators, they picture duels, two fighters squaring off in a sand-covered arena while the crowd roars. And yes, that happened, but the games went far beyond one-on-one combat. Some of the most elaborate spectacles the Roman staged weren't just fights, they were full-on reenactments of battles, historical recreations, choreographed simulations of famous Roman victories, exotic battles, and legendary defeats turned into theaters. The Romans called them munera, which originally meant duties or offerings. These were public displays of power, meant to honor the dead, appease the gods, and remind everyone watching, citizen or foreigner, what made Rome supreme. Most of the time, these reenactments were symbolic. They'd recreate famous battles like the defeat of Hannibal or the conquest of Gaul. Prisoners of war or condemned criminals would be dressed as the enemy and forced to play out their final moments, most of the time with real blood. I just find this whole concept so fascinating, because just imagine today if, like, here in the United States, we, reenacted some of our greatest wars in history, like micro battles of World War II, or even some of the smaller skirmishes from the Revolutionary War with the British. Like, imagine if, like, the Gettysburg reenactments were real and, we could watch from the stands play out in real time and watch the Union crush the Confederates, and it would just be kind of crazy. But to the Romans, this was just normal. Under emperors like Titus and Trajan, the Colosseum was transformed into a full-on battlefield. Engineers would flood the arena to create mock naval battles, where dozens of men in full armor fought on boats, crashing and boarding like it was a war at sea. These weren't small skits. Hundreds of men could be involved. In some cases, entire lakes were dug just to stage these events. One particularly famous reenactment was put on for Emperor Trajan after his victory over the Dacians. To celebrate, he held games that lasted over 100 days and reportedly involved over 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 wild animals. Part of the spectacle involved reenacting the Dacian wars themselves, Roman soldiers versus the barbarians, with carefully scripted outcomes designed to celebrate Roman valor and imperial destiny. And to the audience, it really wasn't just a performance. It was a chance to relive the glory of Rome yourself, to be reminded that they belong to something powerful, ordered, and unbreakable, civilization. The blood in the stands wasn't just for sport, it was an absolute symbol, a reenactment of Rome's dominance over chaos and its triumph over the barbarians and the unknown. The defeated weren't just men, they were representation of the world outside of Rome's walls, of disorder, of threats to Roman identity, and by watching them die, the crowd wasn't just being entertained, they were being told a story, one they already believed in themselves. Rome always wins. And the gladiators? They became stand-ins for the soldier, the martyr, the conquered, the foreigner. It was war without the front lines. It was conquest wrapped in ritual. These reenactments weren't always historically accurate, of course. The goal wasn't to teach history, it was to reinforce myth. To stage a version of the past that reminded the people who they were and who they were meant to be. And that was the thing about Rome. They didn't just fight wars, they performed them. Over and over, in front of tens of thousands of citizens, slaves, soldiers, and foreigners. And the message was always the same. Rome is eternal. Rome is victorious. Rome is civilization. And that story told in blood, sand, and steel became a kind of collective memory. One that didn't just reflect Roman values, it shaped them. Sometimes even the emperor would preside over the match personally. A wounded gladiator might raise a finger, ad digitum, asking for mercy. All the eyes would turn to the emperor. Did he grant it? Deny it? The crowd might chant mite, for mercy, or lagula, for death. In that moment, imperial power was on full display. The emperor didn't just command armies, he controlled life and death in the most literal way. And the people loved it, and they were a part of it. They witnessed justice. They absorbed the values of Rome, not through lectures, but through blood in the sand. It was a civil religion in a sense, a ritualized reenactment of everything Rome believed in. And while it didn't prevent rebellion or collapse in the long run of Rome, it created a powerful illusion that Rome itself was the eternal city. The empire was unshakable, and no matter how violent the world became, it would always be under control. So when we ask whether sport can prevent war, Rome's answer was different from Greece. It didn't use sport to avoid war. They used sport to remind civilized people of who they were without it. And before we leave Rome behind, there's one figure I want to talk about, Commodus. If the Colosseum was the heart of the Roman spectacle, Commodus was its fever dream. He ruled as emperor from 180 to 192 AD, the son of Marcus Aurelius. Where his father spent his life on military campaigns and writing meditations about self-restraint, Commodus was raised in luxury in a palace surrounded by yes-men. And when he became an emperor at just 18, the weight of Rome sat on his shoulders, and he threw it off to grab a sword. The emperor didn't just support the games, he didn't just fund them, he starred in them. He was the athlete. He entered the arena as a gladiator, armed with a short sword and a helmet. And he didn't do it once or twice as a publicity stunt, like a modern-day president visiting the Super Bowl or a championship game. He did it dozens of times, participating in it. He fought in front of packed crowds in the Colosseum, declaring himself the reincarnation of Hercules, parading around in lion skins, wielding a club, basking in the adoration of the Roman mob. Now, let's be clear, he wasn't really risking his life like the other gladiators. The opponents were handpicked, often injured, armed with dull blades, or outright stage managed to die on cue. In one instance, he reportedly fought men with wooden swords while he had a real one. But it really didn't matter, because it wasn't about the fight, it was all about the image. He would sometimes fight hundreds of exotic animals in a single day, lions, tigers, elephants, all from raised platforms where he couldn't be touched. He ordered statues of himself as Hercules placed across the empire. He even renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, and he even named the months of the year after his titles. To the Roman people, this was thrilling, but to the Senate and the elite, it was horrifying. not just because of the arrogance, but because it was a complete inversion of the Roman values. Rome had always admired martial prowess, but it admired it on the battlefield, in the forum, in civic duty. An emperor was supposed to command armies and deliver justice. But Commodus? He turned leadership into performance. He didn't embody Roman strength, he acted it, like a role in a stage play. He was an actor. It's no coincidence that many historians mark the beginning of Rome's decline with the death of Marcus Aurelius and the rise of Commodus. Because when the emperor starts treating the empire like a game, it's a sign of something deeper is breaking. The games were no longer just about reinforcing the values of Rome. Under Commodus, they became about feeding his ego, silencing dissent, and distracting the masses. Gladiator matches weren't reflecting Rome's glory, they were covering up in decay, and eventually the whole facade came crashing down on him. Commodus was assassinated in 192 AD, strangled in his bath by a wrestler, no less in a conspiracy that involved his mistress, Chamberlain, and the Praetorian Guard. His death plunged Rome into civil war and chaos. The very tools he used to entertain the people, the arena, the games, the image of power, really couldn't save him in the end. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? The emperor who thought he was a gladiator pretty much died like one. And this whole story about Commodus in Rome left me with this question. When sport stops being a substitute for violence and instead becomes a symptom of deeper instability, then what happens next? Let's step away from the Roman Empire and fast forward from the ancient world almost 2,000 years. We're going to a different battlefield, a real one and a modern one. Barbed wire, machine guns, trenches filled with mud, frostbite, and fear. And on one cold December night in 1914, in the middle of World War I, a soccer ball gets kicked into no man's land. Let's talk a little bit about the Christmas truce. Where sport didn't reflect war, it briefly interrupted it. It's December 1914, and Europe is just a few months into what will become the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen at that point, World War I. The war is very young, but already brutal. Millions of men have dug into muddy trenches that stretch from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder, rotting corpses, damp earth, and poisonous gas. Between the trenches lies no man's land, a blasted, lifeless strip of mud and barbed wire where death waits in every direction, very similar to like the surface of the moon. And yet, something extraordinary happens. It begins with songs. On Christmas Eve, British soldiers near Ypres in Belgium begin hearing the sound of German voices, not shouting or firing, but singing. The tune? Stille Nacht, or Silent Night. The British respond with carols of their own. Then candlelight, then movement. Against every rule of modern warfare and the rule of their officers, soldiers on both sides slowly emerge from their trenches, hands raised in peace. They meet in the middle, first cautiously, then openly. They exchange small gifts of chocolate, tobacco, buttons, even Christmas pudding. They show each other photos of their loved ones, and they bury their dead side by side in shared graves. Some even help each other carry bodies back to the lines. And then, in at least a few places, something impossible happens. A soccer match. The first Christmas of World War I came after months of bloodshed and chaos. The war was still young, just 5 months in at the time, but already the Western Front had turned into a frozen graveyard. Mud, disease, rats, and constant artillery fire. There was no progress, no clear victory in sight. Just endless waiting and dying in the cold. In West Flanders, Belgium, 2nd Lieutenant Alfred Duggan Chater of the 2nd Battalion Gordon Highlanders woke up on December 25th in a trench barely 100 yards from German lines. The ground was hard with frost, and the air was silent, unusually so. Then something unexpected happened. The Germans started singing Silent Night, their voices drifting across the icy air. The British troops started singing along, and then instead of gunfire came the sound of men climbing out of the trenches. What Chater saw, he later wrote to his mother, was one of the most extraordinary sights that anyone had ever seen. And it wasn't just his unit. Along a 20-mile stretch of the front, the spontaneous truce began to unfold. No orders were given, no treaties were signed, it just simply happened. Men stepping away from the war for just a brief moment of shared humanity. They swapped chocolates and tins of food and passed around beer and smoked cigarettes together. They showed family photos and trimmed makeshift Christmas trees in the trench walls. In more than one spot along the line, a football appeared. Private Ernie Williams, who was just 19 at the time, recalled how it unfolded near Ypres. A ball came from nowhere. No one's quite sure who had it, and soon men from both sides were kicking it around in the open field. Quote, "They took off their coats and some of them put them down as goalposts," he said. There would be at least a couple hundred taking part. No referee. We didn't need a referee for that kind of game. It was like playing as a kid in the streets, kicking the ball about. There was no score, no tally at all. It was simply just a friendly match. There wasn't any real structure to this. There was no official sides, no time limits, but for that brief stretch of time, the men played together. They passed the ball, they slipped in the mud, and they laughed and had fun, just like they were little schoolboys. Hours earlier, they'd been firing rifles and lobbing grenades at each other. Now they were playing football like little kids. And it didn't change the war. It didn't even change the orders that would follow. But in that frozen field at that very moment, something shifted, even if just for a day. At another point along the line, a Scottish regiment played against a group of Germans. They marked a goal with their hats. The match reportedly ended when a German officer intervened, and his side was up 3-2. And even though it all came together without planning, without permission, and without formal negotiation from the officers, it was clear that the men on both sides wanted it. Some came out on Christmas Eve, others waited until the next morning. But they all knew instinctively that something about this day was different. They were just tired. They were tired of death, tired of the cold, tired of pretending that the men across from them weren't just like them. Unfortunately, the ceasefire didn't last long. Most of the truce faded by the evening of December 26th. And by New Year's, the war was back in full force. Commanders on both sides condemned the joint brotherhood. Some British soldiers threatened to discipline anyone caught socializing with the enemy. And on the German side, at least one man refused outright to leave his trench, believing the truce was just downright disgraceful. And his name was Adolf Hitler. But for those who were there, the memory stuck. And for the rest of their lives, many of the soldiers who participated described that Christmas Day as the most meaningful moment of the war, not because of a victory, but because of a brief pause. It was a break in the madness and chaos, and a reminder that even here, surrounded by barbed wire and frozen mud and literal hell on earth, they were still human. Historian Terry Bloom Crocker, who wrote one of the most detailed books on the truce, said it best. Quote, "The football games are really what attracted everyone's attention. There's a really big thing made out of them, and it makes sense, because it wasn't just the game. It was about what the game stood for. And for what it stood for was something simple, but powerful. The idea that even in war, there were moments when people could choose not to hate each other, and choose their brotherhood and humanity. And this wasn't a coordinated peace moment, and it wasn't high-level diplomacy between the governments. It was just a bunch of tired young men who were cold and lonely and scared, who just wanted to feel normal again and feel like kids again, even if that was just for a few hours. And somehow the football helped them do that. And they weren't just trying to make history, but they did. And more than a century later, we still talk about it. Not because it stopped the war. It didn't. But because it showed us what else was possible. There is always potential for something different, something more human, even when everything around us is telling us to hate, to fight, to kill. And for that one day, the soldiers didn't listen. They just kicked a ball instead. In that one moment, war stopped being war. Men weren't targets, they were teammates. The mud wasn't a grave, it was a field. And the barbed wire wasn't a trap, it was the sideline. And the reason that matters, the reason it hits so hard, is because it wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't a diplomatic effort or a PR stunt. It wasn't peace talks or policy. It was human instinct. It was man's spirit breaking through the machinery of death, even just for a day. And it really makes me kind of think, if that can happen, if you could go from a bayonet charge and gas mask to laughter and goal kicks in the same field, then maybe that violent tribal instinct we all carry doesn't have to end in blood. Maybe it could just end in a handshake, or a draw, or a game that no one remembers the score of, but everyone remembers how it felt. Because sport in that moment did what generals and kings couldn't. It brought people back to themselves. And it didn't end the war, it didn't even last that long. The high command quickly shut it down. Machine guns replaced carols. Artillery fire silenced the laughter. And by 1915, the war was more brutal than ever. But we still talk about this soccer match, the truce, the candlelight in the trenches, because deep down, we know what it was. It was proof. Proof that even in the darkest conditions of the human experience, we still carry the capacity to choose something better. And I guess that's what sport really is at its best. It's not just a game, but it's a choice. A choice to confront the primal urge inside of us, to compete, to dominate, to prove ourselves, even to kill. But to do it with rules and within boundaries, and with respect. And to say, I'll fight you, but not with hatred. I'll give you everything I have, and when it's over, I'll walk away from it without taking your life. And that might not stop every war, but it might just keep us human long enough to remember we never wanted one in the first place. But what happens when those stakes are even higher? What happens when it's not two armies facing off, but two worldviews, two ideologies? When the battlefield isn't a trench, but the entire planet. And at any moment, the entire planet can be turned into a global holocaust. Welcome to the Cold War. Because from 1945 onward, the world stood at knife's edge. Damocles' blade was hanging down. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a global staring contest, a chess match. Both with nuclear arsenals capable of ending life on Earth many times over. Both utterly convinced that the other's ideology, capitalism versus communism, couldn't coexist. There wasn't room for both to win, and everyone knew it at the time. But direct war wasn't an option. Mutually assured destruction guaranteed if one side fired, the other would respond, and we'd all go up in a nuclear smoke. So the war went underground. It went psychological, cultural, technological, and yes, athletic. The Cold War was fought in spies and satellites, propaganda films and proxy conflicts, moon landings and in medal counts. Sport became the acceptable battlefield, a way for nations to prove dominance without triggering an Armageddon. And no event symbolized this more than the Olympic Games. We've come full circle here, from ancient Greece to the modern-day Olympics. Every 4 years, the world came together in the name of peace, but the subtext was anything but peaceful. Every sprint, every lift, every dismount, every goal, it was all charged, loaded with meaning. Because behind every athlete stood a system, a way of life, an ideology, a flag, a nation, a world that could either flourish or fall. The Soviets entered their first Summer Olympics in 1952 and immediately signaled what was to come: 71 medals, second only to the United States. And from that moment on, the games weren't just a sport, they were a proxy war in itself. Ideological theater between the two superpowers. And here's the wild part of this whole thing. This worked. Somehow across 4 decades of brinkmanship, coups, invasions, and near-apocalyptic crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, the world didn't come to an end. The bombs stayed in their silos. And instead, we watched gymnasts and sprinters and boxers and swimmers and hockey players carry that tension to the mat, to the ring, and to the field. Every headline, every anthem, every silent podium was a message to the world. We can still fight, but we don't have to burn it all down. And that's something worth thinking about. Because when war becomes near impossible, but the will to dominate still burns, sport becomes the only battlefield we can afford to lose on. And it's not clean, it's not free of propaganda, but it's better than the alternative. It's how two empires, each armed with world-ending firepower, managed to spend a century in conflict without pushing the button. Let's start in 1976 in Montreal. A 14-year-old girl from Romania, a Soviet-aligned country, steps onto the uneven bars. Her name is Nadia Comaneci. She moves with such precision, such grace, that when she lands her final pose, the judges are stunned. So stunned, in fact, they literally don't have the ability to score her performance correctly. The scoreboard flashes 1 because it wasn't even programmed to display a perfect 10. She had done the impossible, the first perfect score in Olympic gymnastics history. And in that moment, for millions watching across the world, communism looked beautiful. It looked disciplined, youthful, unbeatable. Nadia wasn't just a gymnast. She was a symbol of what the Eastern Bloc could create, of how its system, for all its repression, could raise up a girl from a tiny village and turn her into a flawless machine. The message was clear. Look at what we can do. Look at who we are. And then 4 years later, Moscow, 1980. The US and more than 60 Western nations boycott the games in protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. The empty seats were in itself a political theater. For the first time, the Olympics weren't just used as a competition, they were being used as a weapon itself. The Soviet Union dominated the medal count that year because the competition just simply wasn't there. But the absence screamed louder than any victory. It was a cold diplomatic snub played out on the world stage. And let's fast forward to 1984 in Los Angeles. Now it's the Soviets who stay home, along with 14 of their allies, in retaliation for 1980. And again, the US sweeps with the medals, but the games are split in two, not by war but by politics. No bullets were fired, but you could still feel the tension behind every sprint and every anthem and every flag raised. The Olympics weren't about peace anymore. It was a ritualized warfare, the only kind of war these two superpowers could afford. But then there's 1980 again, in Lake Placid, New York, the Miracle on Ice. A group of American college kids, amateurs by Olympic standards, take on the Soviet hockey team, which was basically a professional military-backed machine. The Soviets hadn't lost an Olympic hockey game in over a decade. Their players trained year-round. They were cold, precise, and unstoppable. But that night in the semifinals, something strange happened. The US team held. They out-hustled, out-fought, and out-believed. And they won, 4-3. And it wasn't just an upset, it was an earthquake. Quote, "Do you believe in miracles?" shouted sportscaster Al Michaels. And the country did. Because it wasn't just a win, it was a blow to the Soviet image. A shot of confidence to a nation that was still licking its wounds from the chaos and mishandling of Vietnam, still doubting itself, still wondering if its democracy could hold. But in that moment, it felt like freedom had won. Or at least the West had won. That's how loaded these events were. Because during the Cold War, every gold medal was political. Every athlete was a soldier in a quiet war. And the field of play was the safest battlefield we had. And it's strange to think about, but it's true. Two world superpowers, both armed to the teeth, both with the ability to destroy civilizations, kept their deadliest weapons sheathed. And instead sent runners, divers, gymnasts, and skaters to fight with form, speed, and elegance instead of fire and bloodshed. They used games to wage ideological war. And somehow, despite the pressure, the propaganda, and the paranoia, it worked without a single death. So did all of this actually prevent a war? And that's the question we've been asking this entire time. Because on one hand, it did. These weren't just games, sports, people running fast, throwing things, scoring goals. Because on one hand, yeah, you can make the argument that these are just games. People are just running fast, throwing things, scoring goals. But when you put it into a context, into a geopolitical context, it feels like there's something more going on. I'm not saying the Olympics or international competitions were some kind of magic fix and maybe gave the world an outlet. Maybe they helped people, helped countries work out their tensions without it turning into something much worse. Because you have to kind of remember, during the Cold War, there were real points where things could have gone off the rails, like full-scale, world-changing kind of moments. Berlin in the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the arms race, the proxy wars. Both sides were armed to the teeth and were ready to go to war. And yet, they didn't. They didn't pull the trigger. And maybe part of that is because for decades there was another way to compete, a place to prove who was stronger, faster, and more advanced without firing a single shot. The Olympics became this weird symbolic space where both sides could say, we're still in the fight, without actually declaring war. And that mattered, especially in the Cold War, which was more than just territory. It was about ideology, about pride, about whose way of life was better. And instead of blowing up each other over it, we watched gymnasts and hockey games. And it doesn't mean it was perfect. Sport was definitely used as propaganda too. Let's be honest about that. But it might have helped cool things down just enough, let people feel like they won something. They let leaders save face, let the tension burn off in a way that didn't end in a devastation. Maybe sports didn't stop the Cold War, but maybe it helped make sure it actually stayed cold. And in a century where we already have seen millions of deaths and 2 world wars, there was no appetite for a hot one. So after all of this, after the stories of ancient Greece, of Rome's arenas, of frozen trenches in World War I, and the Olympic podiums of the Cold War, I've been circling back to the same question. Do sports prevent wars? And the answer is, it's complicated. But maybe that's why it makes it worth thinking about. No, sports don't stop war in the literal sense. It doesn't hold back armies or dismantle nuclear arsenals. It doesn't fix the long histories of injustice or erase the motivations for invasions or revolution or genocide. It's not diplomacy, and it's not a shield. But it does do something. Something small but powerful. It gives us a place to put energy that would otherwise burn out of control. And we don't talk about this enough, but history makes something very clear. Human beings are not peaceful by nature. We are wired for conflict, not necessarily for violence, but for friction, for lines drawn and sides taken. Even in peaceful times, we still feel like we have enemies and we can't agree on every issue. Whether it's land, ideas, identity, or honor, we are compelled to compete. And when there are no safe structures for that tension, it spills over into violence, sometimes even revolution, sometimes even into genocide and Holocaust. More often into wars that are remembered by their death toll and not by their victories. That, in my opinion, is what makes sports so important. These are not just games, not just entertainment. It's a ritual, a substitute, a socially accepted, global recognized way to work through the tension that otherwise would explode into something darker and more brutal. I mean, take ancient Greece. The Olympic Games weren't just athletic events, they were peacekeeping tools. The truce gave warring city-states a reason to pause, to meet under the pretense of competition rather than violence. It didn't always hold, but the effort mattered. It gave rivals space to face off without blades. Rome took a darker approach. Their games reflected battles, glorified violence, and reminded the people of the power and reach of the empire. But even there, the arena channeled something. It absorbed the violence of the mob into performance. The people watched instead of acted, and maybe they didn't need to take up arms themselves because of it. And then there's World War I. A football kicked across no man's land did not end the war, but for a moment, it interrupted it. And in that interruption, the men who had been trying to kill each other remembered something, that they were just people in the end of it. They were still just schoolboy children that wanted to play football. They had families. And maybe that hate for the enemy wasn't as natural as they thought that they'd been told by their officers. And fast forward to the Cold War. The Olympics became the stand-in for the battlefield. The US versus the USSR wasn't just fought in space and speeches, it was fought in weightlifting and hockey and gymnastics. It was politics with a scoreboard. And as long as the competition stayed there, the missiles stayed in their silos. And maybe it's a stretch to say sport prevented a nuclear war, but it sure helped contain the fury of it. And now, we're entering a whole other age of tension. Russia and NATO are circling each other again. The US and China are playing a slow game of brinkmanship over Taiwan, technology, and global influence. There's tension in the Pacific, tension in Eastern Europe, tension in our own backyards. And can sports stop it? Of course not. But it can give people, nations, identities, generations, something else to compete in. Something else to believe in, to take pride in, to cheer for, without violence and killing. Because if there's no field, no ring, no arena, the competition won't go away. It's in our blood. It's in our human nature. It just moves somewhere else, somewhere more dangerous. And when I watch international sport now, I see more than athleticism. I see the identity at work. Nations standing tall, rivalries playing out in a way that doesn't require blood. I see the nervous tension of 100 years of diplomacy and war compressed into a 90-minute match. And it reminds me, this is a better version of our old instinct. We still want to prove something as humans. That's never going away. But sports let us do this with rules, with time limits, and with some sense of fairness. There's still pride, but there's also an end. And most of the time when the whistle blows, people walk away and grab a beer after. So no, sports don't prevent war. But they hold the line. They buy us time. They give us an option other than destruction. They give us the language to express what's too dangerous to say with weapons. And that's worth something in itself. So next time you're watching your favorite team, whether it's the World Cup, the Olympics, or just a local rivalry, take just a brief second. Look past the celebration and look past the score. See the intensity, the pride, the anxiety, the old fire that's been burning in humanity since the beginning. And remember, if we didn't have this, that fire still needs somewhere to go. If not on the field, maybe on the streets, maybe in the skies. And we've all studied what that looks like, and we don't need to see it again. Thanks for listening to Talks History with Donnie Dodson. If you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who's just as fascinated with the past as you are. And if you want to explore more of my work, including my historical recipes and video essays, visit eatshistory.com and all of my socials that go by the same name. Until next time, Donnie Dodson.